look at this group. This is the largest webinar I think we've hosted with so many people, so many great smiling faces. But I'm going to introduce 4 of the editors of this Diné reader, celebrating the publication of the first anthology of Navajo literature. This book is presented by UAPress, and it's a book I know that's been a long time coming, and there's a lot of happy editors in this webinar who are excited to present on the topic. So today we have Esther Berlin, who is a writer and multimedia artist. She's a Navajo Nation citizen. Belin is currently a faculty member in the low-res MFA program at the Institute for American Indian Arts, and I believe that's in Santa Fe, if I'm not mistaken. Jeff Berglund is a professor of English and a President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Northern Arizona University. Connie Jacobs is an author and professor emerita at San Juan College. We have Anthony K Webster is a linguistic anthropologist and professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, but he is safely in Illinois and away from the cold of Texas. And I will turn it over to all of you. Thank you so much. And Jeff is going to introduce a few of his other contributors he's invited to the session. So thank you all again. And remember to use chat for your questions, and we'll get to it later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. Yate, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for making time to join us. And thank you to Ollie for encouraging us to share this exciting day with you. I'm here with my dear friends and colleagues, co-editors and contributors to this book that is about to launch. We don't have it in our hands yet. We're anticipating that it will be available in early March, but one of the sites we depend on says that its official date of availability is April. We'll talk more about that later on and the long process that we've been engaged in. Welcome to all of you from all over the world. Put in the chat if you joined us just now, where you're joining us from. I work at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I'm a professor of English. And I wanted to briefly talk about what we'll do over the next 45 minutes to an hour. And then we'll make sure to reserve some time for questions and discussion. I'm going to invite my colleagues to share with us some stories about the origin of this book project. And one of the things I want to say very briefly is that the history of writing by Diné people, Navajo people, is a rich one and a long one. And we by no means are saying that this book is representing for the first time important literature by Navajo people. That is not the case. It has been around for a long time. We are simply bringing together in this format for the very first time the rich range and diversity of voices of Diné writers, poets, essayists, fiction writers, and so forth. We'll then talk briefly about some basic background about Navajo or Diné history. We can even talk about the term Diné, meaning the people in the Navajo language, which is Diné Bizad. We'll then briefly talk about the history of writing in English and in written Diné Bizad. And then we'll get a chance to hear from 3 contributors to the book, all of whom are poets. My colleague and co-editor, Esther Berlin, Tina Dischini, and Vinaya Yazi. And I appreciate you all making time to join us today. And then finally, I'll turn to my friend and colleague, Michael Thompson, who's been an educator for years on the Navajo Nation. And he'll speak a little bit about some resources he developed for our book to support teachers in their adoption of this book in their curriculum. And then we'll open it up to broader discussion. So I'd like to first invite Connie and Esther, and then Tony, if he's interested, to talk about our conception for the book and inspiration for developing this project in the first place.
right, I'll begin. This book began with a single comment by one of my Diné students at San Juan College some years back. I'd been teaching the poetry of Lucy Tapahansa to the classes, and Lucy was then the poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. This student remarked to me later in a conference that he didn't know that there were Navajo writers. Here was a young Diné man living in Kirtland, New Mexico, which is near the Navajo reservation, who had primarily been taught in the high school English classes what we English teachers call the great white 20th century authors, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and William Faulkner. And with due respect to these great writers, none of them are Diné. His single remark opened up both of our lives in ways we never could have expected. I knew then that I wanted to help produce a volume of work by Diné writers for the students of the Four Corners area, both Diné and non-Diné, and I wanted the help of experts to do so. I knew Jeff Berglund from NALS, which is Native American Literature Symposium, and was acquainted with his thoughtful and critically acclaimed work in Native literature, especially in the work of Diné writers. And I knew that he too taught many Diné students in his classes at NIU. He also had shared with me that he had collected a small manuscript of Diné poems to use in his class. So we talked about the book and worked on structuring it. We were both friends with Esther and knew she was essential for this project because of her work as a prize-winning Diné poet, her cultural knowledge, and her friendship with many of the Diné poets. Esther suggested inviting her friend, K Webster, a linguistic anthropologist at the University of Texas, Austin, who had done extensive field work in Navajo poetics on the Navajo Nation with many of the Diné writers in this book. He offered us both his expertise in Diné Bazad, the Navajo language, as well as in the history of Navajo literature. With the 4 editors committed to this project, we brought together our various backgrounds, which has resulted in this volume. As a footnote, that young Diné student who hadn't been taught that there were Navajo writers is one of the contributors in our book, Byron Aspis. I am so proud of the writer he's become and how his innocent bewilderment about not knowing there were Diné writers inspired me and then the other editors to create this book. Our goal is that with this anthology of Native literature available on the reservation in border towns and all over the schools in the Southwest, that Diné students from their early education will know about their writers and their remarkable literary history. Thank you. Esther?
You have to unmute, Esther. There you
Okay. Yat Esther Berlin, Yanisha, Kluge, Dine, Nishla, Twitter Cheatney, Bushes Chin, Kitla Cheatney, Dashache, Touch Cheatney, Dashanilla. So for folks in the audience who are not familiar with the Navajo Nation, I'll be sharing some brief highlights about the land and some history. And these images are of our working group that's here on the Zoom presentation. So we've been working together for a long, long time, and they all collaborated, all of our energy and all of our friendship in the creation of this book. So from this map, we can see that Navajo land encompasses an area of over 27,000 square miles. It's situated on the southwestern Colorado Plateau with elevations varying from 5,000 to 11,000 feet in altitude. And it borders the states of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. So if you're familiar with this area, commonly known as the Four Corners, and our homeland lies within the 4 boundary mountains. Blanco Peak to the east, which you can see is in Colorado, Mount Taylor to the south in New Mexico, San Francisco Peak to the west, which is in Arizona, and Mount Hesperus to the north, which is in Colorado. And so I live just east of the Hesperus Peak. This area is a region of mostly flat-lying sedimentary rock formations, colorful sandstone and shale pinnacles, arches and canyons, and it's also rich in natural resources, coal, oil, and uranium. The 1868 treaty at Fort Sumner ended the imprisonment of the Navajo people at Bosque Redondo and established an official Navajo reservation, which was the map you saw earlier. And that encompassed a small portion of our ancestral homeland. Land was added through piecemeal legislation until 1934, and that reflects its present size of 27,413 square miles. The Navajo Reservation is a federally recognized land base held in trust by the United States government. And that history is foundational in Diné writing, from early boarding school writing to the present. And our book incorporates an historical timeline to acknowledge that, the timeline created by Diné historian Jennifer Nez Dennett-Dale, which includes literary initiatives, such as the creation of the Navajo Times newspaper in 1958, the Institute of American Indian Arts in 1962. Almost half of the contributors in the book are alumni from that school, some from when it was just a high school, and others are graduates from the MFA program in creative writing. In 1968, the Navajo Community College was founded, renamed in 1997 as Diné College, and 3 contributors in the book teach at the Saley campus. And in 2013, Lucy Tapahansa became the first poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. Our current poet laureate is Laura Tohi. In 2017, both Sa Behojon, the Diné Writers Collective, was formed, and the inaugural Emerging Diné Writers Institute, EDWI, was held at Navajo Technical University. The EDWI is now an annual event, and it introduces Diné high school and college students to Diné authors and publishers to inspire and foster students' interests in the writing. So the timeliness of this book aligns with the necessity of it. Aside from general audiences wanting to know more about Diné literary contributions, this book targets emerging Diné writers, as well as those who teach Diné students literature and/or Indigenous studies. This volume contributes to conversations around equity in literature while emphasizing the significant history of Diné contributions to literature.
Thank you, Esther. And we'd like to turn now to Anthony Webster to talk briefly about the history of writing by Diné people.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank everyone for being here. I have a few comments. Written poetry, that is poetry written in some kind of alphabetic system, seems to have begun, at least for Navajos, at the kind of threshold of the thing in the 1930s. And this was poetry that was written in English. Much of it was, and it was meant to be written as a way to teach English. There was a theory of poetry as being easier than prose to write, and so it was meant as a way to teach English. And much of this was taught in the boarding schools or in day schools, schools on the reservation, which Navajos went to. Some of that earliest poetry was published in a Bureau of Indian Affairs (BIA) publication called Indians at Work, and one of my favorite poems, and it's actually a poem that I read in at Diné studies in Shiprock many years ago to a group of Diné, and the poem, not so much my analysis, which was fine, was the thing that people really wanted to talk about and to think about. And I just wanted to, and it's in our anthology, and so I just want to briefly read the poem and then say a bit more about the history of writing. The poem is called If, and it is written by a group of students in Tohatchee, which is in New Mexico, just north of Gallup. If I were a pony, a spotted pinto pony, a racing, running pony, I would run away from school, and I'd gallop on the mesa, and I'd eat on the mesa, and I'd sleep on the mesa, and I'd never think of school. And I think that's a lovely poem. And it shows that while there is the emphasis was on teaching English, students were in fact using poetry for their own purposes to critique, in fact, the very system, the very school in which they were at. The history then of writing poetry in English then continues. There's a great deal of poetry that gets produced in English in the 1960s. Especially through the Bureau of Indian Affairs again, and especially at the IAIA, the Institute of American Indian Arts, in Santa Fe. And various anthologies were produced, some with the acronistic names like Arrow, in the late 1960s and early 70s. Henry Tinhorn publishes at the Intermountain Indian School, A Handful of Sand, and other work was published around this time as well. Gloria Emerson, whose coffee shop image we showed a bit earlier with Awegowe, was published in the Indian Historian, which is a publication in the 1960s and 70s, a very politically targeted kind of thing out of San Francisco. And poetry then begins in English, then begins to really take off. The other question is the history of writing in Navajo, and that has a kind of different kind of trajectory. The earliest kinds of alphabetic writing in Navajo were by missionaries and anthropologists, and it was not written for Navajos or Diné. It was written for other missionaries and other anthropologists. In the 1930s, Gladys Reichert begins the Hogan School outside of Ganado, which is over in Arizona, as an attempt to create a writing system, an orthography for Navajos. In the late 1930s, Robert Young, John Peabody Harrington, and most importantly, William Morgan, who was himself Diné, work on what becomes the orthography for the reservation, for the Navajo Nation. And this is the orthography that is still by and large used to today. And it was a practical orthography. It was meant to be used by Navajos, and a number of writing of literature was produced in the 1940s and 50s, and then it kind of shifts away from that. And there's the big emphasis in the 1960s and 70s at the community schools for Rough Rock Demonstration School, Rock Point Community School, and also Navajo Community College, where a lot of bilingual education begins, and this is when a lot more emphasis on writing in Navajo also begins. And you begin to see some publications out of this as well, including Between Sacred Mountains, which came out of Rock Point, and also The South Corner of Time, which also was published by the University of Arizona. And in 1977, Nia Francisco in the journal College English publishes a poem Tache, Sweat House, which really is one of the first published poems in Diné Bazad in a kind of larger venue. And since then, a number of poets have begun to write in Diné Bazad, including Rexley Jim and Laura Tohi, who was mentioned earlier, and their poetry is also included in the anthology. And so now there's poetry being written in English and poetry being written in Diné Bazad. And our anthology tries to capture that kind of diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I'd like to invite Tina Dischini to now read and share with us some information about her own background and career as a writer and as a professional. Tina.
Yeah, everyone. I am Tretne Sahni Nishle, Twaheglini Bashichin, but Ani Dashanala, Kis Ani Yakindet Bashiche. So I'm telling you that I'm Diné, but my grandfather is a Palaka. In fact, the name Palaka, Arizona is, that town was named after my family, the Palakas. And so they live on First Mesa. And I'm a grandmother, a rancher now. I've been home on the reservation, taking care of land and cattle for almost 2 years now. I retired as the administrator for the Dream Diné Charter School in Shiprock, I guess nearly 2 years ago. Before that, I was a provost at Navajo Technical University. So I've worked in K-12 and in the tribal college system for 30 years and am now enjoying life. And I've always really felt compelled to record stories and started doing so through poetry when I was pretty young, maybe in like 3rd grade, probably due to the influence of a wonderful teacher at that time. And since that time, I have written a lot of poetry about family and experiences and just about things that have happened in my life. And I've been very low profile. I have kept my writing really close at hand and only shared with family members. And then a few years ago, I, through my work with schools, became acquainted with Esther. And at the same time, I'm kind of a late bloomer. Even though we're about the same age, I was in Lucy Tapahansa's classes at UNM. And so, of course, these women really influenced me. And I finally started stepping out with my poetry and reading around the Four Corners area, primarily in schools. And then both as an educator and as an administrator in schools, it was always my interest to invite poets to the schools where I was at. And so I became acquainted with many poets through that process, bringing them to the schools and exposing them to students. And then also as an educator, becoming aware of the need for student awareness of Native poetry. And so all of that over the years has helped me to evolve as a writer. I also served for a brief time as the editor at the Tribal College Journal, and we featured the writings of tribal college students across the country and in Canada. And they were incredible writers, really wonderful writers at these different college campuses. And that was a great joy to be able to do that, to share their writings. So I've really been excited and happy about the opportunity to be a part of the Diné Reader. I have been a lifelong reader, of course. And so I'm just really happy about the idea of joining this group of writers. And I guess Jeff mentioned at the outset, I'm really privileged to be friends with all these people here. And then many of the writers who are featured in the Diné Reader. And so we are a close-knit group, and we hold the stories of our lives as Diné people really close at heart. And I think we're very proud to be able to share our stories with the world now. So very exciting. I have a poem that is in the Diné Reader that I'd like to share with you. It's called "You Bring Out the Diné in Me." You bring out the Diné in me, that repressed giggle, urge to hide behind the folds in someone's skirts, or to run away, never looking back. But then maybe that's just because you are the one I'd run away to, leave my cluttered house for, give access to my secrets, a few of them at least. You bring out the Chief Manuelito's wife in me, Juanita, the one who stares back from the 1868 photograph, unflinching, the Diné woman warrior in me, the one who could stand her ground against the US Army marching over Narbona Pass, the grinding stone in me, heavy and rough, crushing kernels down to fine white powder, the shit-kicking, ass-whipping, fling you around the dance floor vixen in me, the pounding, mounting, insistent, non-stop, arm-deadening drum beat in me. You do, yes, you do. You do, you do. You bring out the long walk tragedy in me. The pain of it, the confusion and horror of it, all of it, the uranium mining, coal-fired plant threat in me, the dread of politicians, the emptiness of campaign promises, the lure of quick casino cash. You bring out the onslaught of poverty in me, the reliance on low-rent HUD housing and general assistance checks, the numbness of food stamps and WIC vouchers, the fear of talking to my own kids, the fear of their possible arrogance, their possible disregard of all that I believe in. You bring out the cultural struggle in me, the frustration with each new season of TV amorality and movie blockbusters. Shoot 'em up, drink it down, and smoke it up. The hatred for every singer screaming, treat my woman like a bitch. Ooh, you do. Thankfully, though, you also bring out in me the woman who can still roll corn husk smokes, burning her lips to keep little fires sparking at the tip, the fantastic smell of roasted mutton wrapped in soft tortillas in me, the hope of snow-crested sacred mountains, their names in me, their songs which hum in me all on their own. You bring out the white shell in me, the turquoise in me, the pollen in me, the first woman in me, the my little sweetie, sweetie grandma in me, the one who longs for tiny hands to hold on to, the Diné woman in me. Yeah, you do. You bring out the slam that damn door shut in me. You conflict me. You bring out the arrogance in me. You bring out the I will fight back no matter what in me. Even though my enemy is sly and cunning, both loud and silent, articulate in other languages, present in body, in music, in words, in print, on screen, in cyberspace, and as oppressive as fog falling from sky to earth, cloaking all, like nothing and everything. Even so, I will fight back. And I will wait for you as faithfully as the sun and moon trade light and fire and power. And oh, all that time, my smile will be sweet, my looks demure, shy. Yeah, right, you bring it all out in me, here. So I really have been influenced, like I have said, by Diné writers forever, but I'm also very deeply impacted by other writers because I have always read just anybody. And I love Sandra Cisneros because she's so arrogant and she's in your face, she's vulnerable. and so I was really happy to be able to work from this poem, her You Bring Out the Mexican in Me. There were just so many parallels with what I know about being a Diné. And so this poem was influenced by her poem, and I'm very proud to have shared that with you. As Esther spoke about earlier, the Diné people were incarcerated for a time at Bosque Redondo. And so this poem talks to or speaks to Juanita, the wife of Manuelito, our Navajo chief. And I have always been really honored to be a Diné woman and to think about the place that Juanita had in our history and how strong she appears in the photographs and just the stories that are told about those times from when our people recovered from incarceration and returned to the Diné Nation. And so I think this poem honors all of that. And then I have one other poem that I'd like to read. It's called An Introduction to Slow Boy. I remember the first time I needed the help of an elder and I had to go alone without my mother. Where are you from? He asked. From Blackwater, I said, meaning Whiskey Creek. From whose place? He asked. My grandfather was called Tohayi, the one who dug wells, I replied. Ah, he said, the Hopi man, that Kisani, yeah. You're from the other side of the mountain. And then he smiled and shook my hand. And I was so happy to be the granddaughter of Hawila Palaka. So my grandfather passed when I was about 1 year old, so I never got to know him. But there are such incredible stories about my grandfather. And as a grown woman, when I needed the help of an elder with special songs and prayers and ceremony, it was really incredible to be able to go into this elder's house and tell him who my grandfather was from decades ago. And that was what gained me entrance to his home. And the same is true for my grandmothers, whose names carry so much weight among the families. And when I need to go for help from someone, I can always tell them what their names were. And they will say, oh, okay, come on in, granddaughter, come on in. And so that's what that poem is about. And even though my grandfather was from First Mesa, he lived most of his life on Navajo, married to my grandmother in Crystal, New Mexico, which is where my husband and I and my family, we currently also live in Crystal, which is where we're raising cattle. And so my grandfather, the Tewa man, he was out there living among the Diné people, and he was a well digger. He was digging wells, and so he is so well known. And it has been such a treasure for me to be able to recite his name and the names of my grandparents to people and for them to welcome me. And that's how we know each other in Diné country, is by our grandparents, through our grandparents. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share those two poems. And I can't wait for you all to read the Diné Reader. Yeah, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you so much, Tina. When you get a chance, check out some of the comments that have been made in the chat during your reading. If we were together in a poetry reading, we might do this as the young cool kids do these days. But I really appreciate your reading. Thank you. I think I'm not alone in saying we want to see a full book of your poetry out in the world. So I hope you're hard at work on that. And I know there'll be publishers that are interested. So thank you. And I'm going to turn now to my colleague and dear friend, Esther Berlin, and invite her to talk a little bit more about herself and her writing. And I'm going to try to project one of the poems that's included in our reader right now. So Esther.
Oh, thank you, Jeff and Tina. That was a great reading. It's always good to hear you read. So this poem that's on the screen is an example of some of the visual poems that I've been working on for the last few years. And I started doing a lot of the visual kind of mapping poetry to try to give a space and an understanding to the experience of the boarding school students, the ones who left or were taken off reservation and, you know, just indoctrinated to not only learn a new culture and way of life, but a language. And the force of that really detrimented the soul and the spirit of many of these students. And my parents were part of the boarding school era. And so for me, trying to go back and figure out how they first started imagining English or creating words or a sense in another language is still really fascinating to me. So this is an example of that. So I have the two lines there, and for the Navajo people, we see ourselves as complete with in regards to, we have a male side of our body and a female side, and so that creates a complete person in our worldview. And so that's where the visual diagram goes. And then I have these points of reference, and then I have an assignment for the reader. So part of the assignments that I give to the readers are really in response to people and the historical sort of trauma imposed by either anthropologists who are digging and studying our remains, or digging and studying us as a people, even while we're alive in boarding school, or our language to a certain extent. And so I really felt like, you know, when I meet people who are of that mindset, who are really just trying to get information out of me, is kind of re-traumatizing a lot of the history and a lot of my journey as a Diné, in processing how I ended up growing up out in the LA area because my parents went to boarding school. So I grew up off the Navajo reservation. So the assignment, this is assignment 43, to number 1, find the complementary points, 2, plot the coordinates at their intersection, and 3, use the visual text created as a key for the diagrams. So this is kind of my response, or my challenge for readers in regards to the difficulty and sort of the direction of how do you start this process, right? If you're doing this assignment, what do all these things mean? And how do I like plot these points? And how do I know where they intersect? And that kind of emotional state, I feel, is really similar to what I interpret happened when, you know, my parents were encountering the English language, or, you know, dealing with just average people in the LA area, you know, who didn't know where they were from, who kind of mistook them for someone else, and still does, right? Even though LA still remains one of the urban centers that has one of the highest Native American populations, we're still really, really small in that pool inside LA, just because it's such a big place. So this is an example of one of the poems, and when I talk to people or different audiences, especially in schools, we do these assignments. Students do these assignments, and it's really fun to have them be creative and to give meaning to these abstract things. And that's what this poem is really all about. So thank you for that, for going on me with that explanation. And I do want to, so we have over or just about 30 writers in our collection. So I do want to honor a couple of writers by reading some of their work. And the first writer is Lucy Tapahansa. You may be familiar with her work. She was our first poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. And I'm going to read a poem of hers that's in the collection called Hills Brothers Coffee. My uncle is a small man. In Navajo, we call him Shadae, my mother's brother. He doesn't know English, but his name in the white way is Tom Jim. He lives about a mile or so down the road from our house. One morning, he sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. I just came over, he said. The store is where I'm going to. He tells me about how my mother seems to be gone every time he comes over. Maybe she sees me coming, then runs and jumps in her car and speeds away, he says, smiling. We both laugh just to think of my mother jumping in her car and speeding. I pour him more coffee, and he spoons in sugar and cream until it looks almost like a chocolate shake. Then he sees the coffee can. Oh, that's the coffee with the man in a dress, like a churchman. Ah, that's the one that does it for me. Very good coffee. I sit down again and he tells me, some coffee has no kick, but this one is the one. It does it good for me. I pour us a cup and while we wait for my mother, his eyes crinkle with a smile and he says, yes, yes, this is the very one, putting in more sugar and cream. So I usually buy Hills Brothers coffee once or sometimes twice a day. I drink a hot coffee and it sure does it for me. So that's Lucy Tapahansa's poem. And many of you may be familiar with her. She taught for a while at U of A. And the next poet I'd like to honor is Gray Coho. And he is one of, I think, two authors in our book who have already passed on. So he died in 1999, but he was a prolific artist in general. He was a painter, a poet, and a fiction writer. And the poem I'm going to share is so lyrical. It's really got a fluid rhythm, very playful imagery, and it really, I feel like even though he may have been lesser known or people are rediscovering his work now because he was mostly known for his visual art, I can see so many influences in this piece that he wrote in 1985 in some of the poets we have writing now contemporarily. So he was ahead of his time in writing this I guess this new idiom, this new expression of combining a Navajo lens using the English language. And it's a long poem. I'm just going to read a couple of sequences from it. Awaken me, red house born again. 1. Image maker, dippers, Tosito raindrops. Must make believer, yet as mythic in this fallow eye, but name me his only newborn, midst reminders rusted and hallowed skull, he kindles magic mind of cross-legged fetishes, so might I bridge nomadic moods across still crazier eyes. Wisdom he talks, walks in robin beauty, from mica meadow away, so come shade rainbowed brow, and form forth. Thunders, teardrops he spits. I sip, squint, sift, whence eaglet verses call. Whilst unknowing sensation, blindfolds with dirty instincts, remind me odic memoirs, waken a while from salty nightmares ago, and begin selfish souls. Behold, the fool, the true blue owlish, with white man wishbone, and bear his reincarnation, kissing horny stares in a looking glass. Cosmos cleared this secret sleep. You say we betray Navajo grandfathers, 'cause coyote poetress is our only bittersweet seer. 2. Joyous is veil voice from carcass cradle, re-echoing hail-stoned Hogan, calling me back like lamed lamb romps into trickster's passions. 3. Horned toad at prey I caged, red antway Anasazi at play I harmony, since two tiptoes too few, retracing abalone alleys in eclipse. He who rhymes, wind-eaten wings, slung a sinew string of emetic effigies, basalt bones, fingertip, angelic lip, of dawn bearer on coming for flesh warmth, wink, erotic pass, at night-long notion he greets anyhow. Come suckle honeysuckle plumes in bob-wire twist, let alight straws of borrowed bones. 4. Over grape-sweet sweats of soot shoulder, I thumb flick each yellow word of Totalina teach. Crinkling porcelain chins, she whizzes. What hellish way I'd sharpen my Christmas pencil. Remember tin taste from painted panes of January promises, since thawed by hummingbird hunger. Whoever mistakes a fawn fet at slate saliva, but memorized my metaphors may ne'er die. 'Twas that boarding school serenader who worships missing moons with dime store wreath left behind by coward creator, drifting by in stone blind selfness. Dearest at apple red breath, Sabbath rumors arisen from one tooth grin of urban Indian. 'Tis why I weep behind cornhusk mask of fire dance clown. Cuss me coyote jokes, but could two-dimensional tongue e'er let me laugh in Navajo English? So there are a total of 14 stanzas. So I just read the first 4. So kind of a tease for you all to get the book, because he is one of my all-time favorite artists. I first knew of his work through his two-dimensional series, mostly a lot of prints. And then when I found out that he was a poet as well, it really launched me into a new direction to study his work. So thank you for letting me share. Yeah.
Thank you, Esther, for sharing your own work and 2 of the other writers in our anthology. Greg Coho's life story, is ended in tragedy, and he was so full of potential, and his early work garnered some attention, but history lost sight of him for a while, and we hope to rectify that and change that course. He definitely was an early innovator. I now have the pleasure of turning your attention to Diné Yazzie, another contributor and friend of ours, whose work is in the book. And many of us on the panelists have been fans of Diné's work for years. She's also an accomplished, talented visual artist whose work you can find online and on the covers of many books, several of which have been published by the University of Arizona Press. I invite Diné to introduce herself and say more about herself and her work as an artist, both in words and in other mediums. Diné.
Can you hear me? Diné Yazzie Yanishia. Hoantane Nishla Ado Todicini Bachishin. Shache Toheglin Yado Shanaland A Kisani. I could add another Kisani as some Nishla. Tatat the Shagan de I say Shao I does not the Okay, so I introduced myself in Navajo. My name is Diné Yazzie, and I am glad to be here today with some of the people that are here in the poetry business, in the art of poetry. I guess the introduction you already did. I don't know what else to say. I'm from New Mexico, born and bred. 505 life is my true vibe. My only ancestors that are in Arizona are my Hopi relatives, and also from the First Mesa, Palaka area through my grandfather. And, you know, that's pretty much who I am. What else did you want me to share? I'm sorry.
No, that's great, Diné. And what work would you like to share with our audience today?
Oh, okay. About poetry.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I guess if you were born in Navajo or a Pueblo person, you're already a poet. I think our narrative and our dialogue here, you know, we're rooted in oral history for pretty much our whole lives. Even when we're adults, you know, we are a part of that oral history that's perpetuated. And, you know, for those of us living now in this era, within the past year, we're a part of this new narrative, right, about disease. And I was thinking about that when, you know, you guys were talking about the long walk and how traumatic that was for our people. And I think that's a new narrative that I've been focusing on, because we have these little kids. You know, I work with a lot of children in my community through the arts, and what I'm seeing is those same, I think, tendencies to cope come back up. And now I'm realizing how important art is going to play a role in the lives of our Indigenous children, of all children, but me specifically working with Indigenous children is going to be a very important part of the work that I see myself doing within this next couple of months and then through the coming years. So, you know, I think it's important that this book comes out now at this time, because teachers are going to be looking for avenues to help their children heal in their own classrooms. And, you know, I think when you integrate visual arts into like dialogue and speaking arts, there's going to be like a real important medicine or remedy that's going to take place. So, you know, I think that's important that this reader comes out when it's coming out. And, you know, I think it's going to be great to have those in our border town classrooms for both non-native teachers and native teachers. Because what I found too, working in the classrooms as a poet, is that even our Diné teachers and other native tribal teachers, they don't know the resources to go to. You know, we take for granted that they do, but a lot of them don't. because they always say, well, I'm not an artist, I don't know where to go for all this, you know, so it's really important right now. So that's pretty much how I see myself now as a poet, like, but more of like an advocate for our Indigenous children and young adults. Yeah, that's all.
Great, thank you. I didn't know if you wanted to share one of your poems that's included in our book.
Okay, you choose which one. I don't remember. Or let's see. I guess the one I could do is the Pine Nut Eaters, because that's the one
That's a fun one. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
So this is called the Pine Nut Eaters, and I have it in this book. Can you see that book? I can't see myself on the screen. But that poem was included in this anthology. So it's called the Pine Nut Eaters. You've seen them sitting still, sitting peaceful, sitting with their itchy fingers pinched at their desert mouths, their granular taste buds waiting for that earth taste, pine nut taste, nutty taste of desert earth mingled with pine nut. Navajos have scurried to and fro. Navajos from Tucson, Arizona, traveled east in the direction of Cisna, Diné. Packed into double cab trucks, Navajos from Cuba speed down Interstate 40 east. After pit stops in Gallup, they exit at Bernalillo and drive north to the Cuba area, where they got word that the pinon nuts are huge. They sleep, but only with cloud visions of salted roasted pinons dancing above them, just like the night before Christmas story, but instead of visions of sugar plums, they see only deep brown pinon shells. Huge monster pine nuts, dancing circles around their twitchy bedheads. Just last weekend, the women in Hopi shouted, "Bring us pinons, we want pine nut taste on our mesa tongues. The trees around here don't have pinons on them. We want to eat pinons too." You've seen them sitting, standing, kneeling, sitting with empty pinon shells all around their feet. Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Vinaya.
Mhm.
Appreciate it. I'd like to invite Michael Thompson now, a friend of mine as well, to join us, to step up. He's been on screen the whole time, but to step up and share with you all a little bit about himself, his experiences as a teacher on the Navajo Nation, as well as some of the work he did to contribute to the teacher resources for our book. And while Michael starts talking, I'll share with you one page from the book related to the resources. So, Michael.
Yeah, Jeff. Yat Shea Michael Thompson, which be a Chakie Yenisha, Muskogee Creek Nishna. My name's Michael Thompson, and I am a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. I'm retired now, but most of my life I was a high school English teacher. I've taught everything from middle school to college. And actually, I'm married to Tina Deschini, who's in the other room. So I've been in New Mexico as an educator, living here and working here for the last almost 25 years now. And just before I came to New Mexico, I spent several years in the mid-90s in Southern California, and I became very involved in several large urban native groups from Southern California that I'm still connected to, and also with some urban native groups in Albuquerque. But I spent the bulk of my teaching years here in New Mexico teaching in Bloomfield, New Mexico, and then at San Juan College, where Connie Jacobs once taught. And in both of those institutions, in Bloomfield High School and in San Juan College, the majority of a population of our students was always Navajo. And Probably one of the main reason I came to New Mexico was because I met Tina and we got married. And so I've always been amazed by her writing, and I knew she was a talented poet. And then after I moved here, I got to know so many of these people that are editors of this anthology and other writers in our area. And we've just all known each other for a very long time. And one of my primary concerns as an educator, particularly a high school and college educator in the Southwest, has been to increase representation of Native literature in our English classrooms. It's something that still surprises me, has not been corrected. There is really not adequate representation of our Native authors in our English classrooms in almost any public schools that I know, and also true on many of the schools on the reservation. And part of it is the lack of books like the Diné Reader, where writers from a particular tribe, really excellent writing is collected into an anthology. So one of the great exciting things about getting asked to work on the book was to help develop some kind of guiding questions and reflective tasks that teachers and students might use to make sense of the Diné Reader. And so you can see on screen, this is the beginning of the section of resources for teachers and readers that I worked on with actually, I think almost all of the editors were part of this effort to develop this section as well. So I think there are 11 sections in this resource guide. And the first two were kind of, I guess, what you would expect anytime you looked at a literary anthology. So there was this section on writing and literary form and looking at form and structure in poetry, which I always enjoyed myself as a high school English teacher teaching poetry. And, structure versus free verse, stanzas and rhyme schemes and rhythm, all of those elements are part of Navajo poetry just as well as they are any other kind of poetry. So there were two sections, the form, literary form, and then I think the next section on figurative language were kind of predictable things that you would have in any literary anthology. But that's where it became much more challenging and very exciting to work on, because my goal was to try to create resources that would provide a Navajo specific lens for readers. And so by that, I spent a lot of time looking through many of the works that were going to be included in the anthology. And I started looking at thematic connections between the Navajo poets, like what were some common themes, what were some common subject matters. And then from having lived in the Four Corners area myself and having friends and relatives and family who were Diné, having been to many ceremonies and having talked to a lot of elders, I sort of knew that there were certain things that are always going to be significant and important in making sense out of the world for a Navajo person. And so, we're looking at things like the Four Sacred Mountains. We're looking at the different elements of creation stories, looking at things like the Long Walk, which has really special significance, looking at the boarding school experiences of grandparents and parents and how education has impacted Native cultures. So really, I wanted to create resources that would help teachers make sense of and provide a context for their students to read Navajo writers and understand the context in which they were writing in. So it was really exciting and really hard. And I had a lot of help from Jeff and Esther and Connie and others in trying to create that lens. And the other thing I would say about these resources that became apparent to me as I worked on them, and that is that the resources, well, even the questions themselves, had to reflect the diversity of the Navajo writers, because just like all of the Native Americans that are part of the United States, there is a huge diversity across tribes. And even in the same region, there's a great difference in the cultural context for Navajos and the Pueblos, for example, or for the Apache communities, or for the tribes where I'm from in the Oklahoma area. So that's also true within a tribe. So within the Navajo tribe, there are many writers who went to boarding schools, some of the older writers, but there are also more recent writers who have gone off to graduate school and doctoral programs in different places and have had pretty positive experiences in the academic world. And so those are part of Navajo experience too. There are many Navajo people in our area who are very traditional and still practice many of the old ceremonies, but there are also many Navajo people who may be Christian or may be Mormon or may be atheist, so there's this range of the types of Navajo people that there are. There's not just one kind of Navajo person, and there's not one kind of Navajo writer. So I think for me, the greatest challenge here was to provide an opportunity to have questions that would shape discussion, that would shape writing, and would shape reading, that really opened up the readers to the huge variety and complexity of Navajo world. And so I really enjoyed this work, and I really am in great awe of the many writers that are collected in this anthology. And I greatly appreciate the work that the editors went to and the long perseverance that they continued until this work got finished. So I appreciate everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We appreciate you too, and are so glad you're part of this project. We want to open it up to questions and that you may have for any of our panelists or editor, well, all of us are panelists, any of the poets, other contributors to the anthology. Thank you to the host of OLLI for putting up information about the book. The University of Arizona Press has generously given a discount, I know, to the OLLI participants and to others we are sharing this code with. The book here in the catalog copy says it will be available in April. And we hope that this reader commands the attention the writer's talent deserves. So thank you for joining us today, and we will be here to continue to answer your questions. And I understand Scott and or Christina,
Yes.
People will pose those questions in the chat, or perhaps they have posed them to you separately.
Yeah, we'd ask everybody to put your questions in the chat, and we'll bring you on and let you ask your questions directly. But while we're waiting for that, I want to thank you all very much for and this is amazing contribution. I think will serve as an amazing resource for many years to come. And I was wondering if you might help our audience better understand the context of the boarding schools in particular. Came up several times, and I'm not sure everybody quite realizes that history, and it's very fresh history too. And obviously Tony talked about it immediately with his the teaching English and poetry, and Esther touched on it. And I wonder if somebody would just kind of let our audience know a little bit more about that background, because it's so impactful part of, who Navajos are today. And somebody would be willing to speak to that.
I can say something briefly if you want, and then others can fill it in. I mean, the boarding school, I mean, there were a number of different kinds of schools that began to exist on the Navajo reservation, as it was called at the time. Some were boarding schools, some were day schools. There were also schools that were away from the reservation in various other places. The history, and these were schools where where children were, the boarding schools were schools where children were sent away from their homes and often did not have contact with their family until they returned for the summer. And even then they didn't necessarily return in the summers because there were various kinds of jobs they could have there. And they were either run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or by a number of different missionary groups. And so there was often a very kind of aspirational kind of view of socializing Navajos into some kind of imagined kind of dominant American society, and that meant of speaking English. And so they were often schools that did not tolerate much use of Diné, for instance, though of course the students did in fact use that. And I will say many of the poets like Laura Tohe and Black Horse Mitchell, both who went to boarding schools, have written much about their experiences in those kinds of situations.
Thank you. We have a question from Judith Rocky. Judith, if you'd like to unmute yourself, give me 1 second. Oops, sorry. Go ahead, Judith.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering if any of the panelists are aware of an oral history of poetry that maybe had been passed down through the generations before the written language, Navajo written language. I'm thinking, I just remember that, learning in school that in biblical times, a lot of the scriptures were taught orally because, first of all, there weren't any books, and also people didn't read or write. So I'm wondering if there might have been an oral history to the Navajo and Diné poetry.
Anyone want to take that on?
I think we're all pausing because many of us could weigh in, and we probably weigh in different ways. The very quick answer that I'll give, and then invite some of the Diné panelists to jump in because you're even more knowledgeable, is that yes, there was a deep and rich, vibrant, long-running and sustained history of expressive arts. And the divisions between the secular world and the spiritual world are not so finite. And so the function of what we today would call a poem or literature was much more expansive and integrated in comprehensive ways into daily life and then ritual life. And so that's what I want to say, is that when we are talking about poetry today, we can look to a number of different terms, usages that are historical and that can be traced back through time immemorial. So we're talking very much about a written history that's then made public, right? And that's a different kind of process. And there are some parts of that oral tradition that were particular to people with privileges based on age or based on position in the community, based on a ritual cycle. So there are stories that were particular to a time in the year even. And so when we talk about poetry, song, prayer, it all gets mixed together when we look at the deeper history beyond the written record. So that's all I should say. Is there anything more that Tina or Vinaya or Esther you'd like to weigh in on?
Hi, this is Tina. I can say that every time I go to a ceremony, there are such incredible old songs and chants that have been sung or recited since forever, and which have never been written down and that have been passed on orally. There are such incredibly beautiful recitations about our four sacred mountains and about other aspects of Diné life, stories associated with our creation that have been passed down, and certainly those could be regarded as poems. They're expressions of what life means for us as Diné people that have been kept and treasured and that we hang on to as much as possible. So yes, I can say that, I mean, the information that Michael shared about the different, the formats of our poetry and the way that we recite certain lines of our poetry, they all have roots in what we've heard from, our family members, what we've heard in songs and prayers. So yes, everything is connected. Everything has been handed down for generations.
Got a question from Jeff Yamauchi. Jeff, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I kind of wish that the anthology was published a little later. What are you guys thinking about or reflecting about just during this time of COVID?
What kind of artistic things are happening with you all with COVID?
So I can speak a little. I have been doing some art collaborations with visual artists around the Four Corners and been writing about COVID, sort of the fitting into the general sort of arc of trauma and disease on the indigenous peoples in the US. So I think, when you talk about that, and I'm not sure exactly what you're thinking of when you think of COVID and how it affected us, but I know our tribe took a big hit in regards to the effects, the physical health effects, and the emotional, spiritual health is really sort of in a sense re-traumatizing or recalling a lot of the memories of early boarding school, which were there were epidemics throughout boarding schools that killed many students. And and just when different invaders came through homelands of tribal people, that is also recurrent as well. So I think that theme, like, I don't think it would change much. I think that theme of trauma and that theme of healing and recovery and moving forward is very much present in our book. Like, I think this is just a new sort of, or not new, but it's the form is new in our lifetime. I know when people are saying, oh, in our lifetime, this is the worst thing that happened. I think it's fair to say for indigenous people that it's still happening. Like it's still in our memory, our collective cognitive memory. Like we still have people old enough who experience those forms of trauma, either through disease and or boarding school or other type of racial injustices. And then what's on the screen is a collaboration between myself and photographer Chip Thomas. And he basically creates or restructures abandoned buildings and sides of buildings on the reservation into mini galleries, and he pastes his photographs on there, and then I did a couple collaborations with him, and this is my poem with his photograph.
And this was done as an effort to draw attention to the experiences of people on the Navajo Nation when the COVID pandemic really was just beginning in April and May, right? And Chip Thomas is an artist and physician living and working on the Navajo Nation. He is not Diné, but he works and lives amongst Navajo people and serves the communities through this art as well.
We have another question related to the boarding school. Frankie Harris, if you'd like to unmute yourself. Well, maybe he's gone, but let's see if we have another. How about Margaret Augustine? Margaret, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was wondering when they talk about the medicine men and how much did they contribute to poetry? The American medicine man, or what? The healer?
Mm-hmm.
Let me take a shot at this. I've sat in many kind of Native American ceremonies, both within the Navajo tribe and with other tribes. And I think what Esther and Tina noted earlier, and I imagine that Vinaya would concur, the medicine men, the healers, the singers, the elders who conduct ceremonies, they've been doing that for thousands of years. And so those older songs and those prayers, those do get handed down through the oral tradition, but they're not gone. They continue, they're happening right now. Somewhere on Navajo Nation, there's a ceremony going on and a singer is singing a song that's 1,000 years old. But those chants, those songs, those prayers, those are kind of within the sacred purpose situation, I would say. Those belong in ceremony. And the poetry that reaches out into the secular world, I think, is inspired by those sacred songs and those ancient stories. But it is not quite the same thing as those sacred songs and those sacred stories, because they belong in that sacred space. They don't belong out here. That's what I've been taught in my tribal tradition, and that's what I believe is common to many Native American tribes. But Esther, Tina, you guys could jump in, and Vinaya.
Well, I think I'm gonna. Oh, go ahead, Tina. I was just gonna say that I would like Tony to add something in regards to the linguistics of the Navajo language, because there is something we haven't really talked about it in sort of the internal poetics of the language itself.
And I was just going to say there are some traditional practitioners who are also poets, but modern poets who are included in the Diné reader.
Yeah, I was going to actually say the very thing that Tina was going to say, that, poets like Rexley Jim and Black Horse Mitchell are both practitioners, but they're also poets, and their poetry is meant to speak to a larger audience. The purpose may be in line with, making right the world, as it were, but it's a public facing kind of thing, and we should not confuse those kinds of things. It is true, and I have a whole chapter in my first book on poetic devices in Navajo and the ways that those poetic devices in the kind of traditional oral tradition, many of those kinds of things have been used in contemporary poetry as well. And you can see the ways that certain forms of parallelism, repetition, with variation of fours, uses of sound symbolism, other kinds of ways of using the language, that there's a long and beautiful tradition of poetic discourse in Diné Vazad, and that those kinds of things have been brought into both poetry written in Diné Vazad, but also poetry written in English as well. And one can think of Lucy Tapahansa's This Is How They Were Placed and things like that very much partake of particular kinds of poetic devices that you find. And so there is a long poetic tradition and a beautiful poetic tradition that continues and expands with each new generation as well. And that's one of the things you can see in the anthology.
Well, we're nearing the final couple minutes of our presentation, and I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all for your efforts in creating this publication. And I truly hope it inspires a whole volumes and volumes of future publications and inspires future writers on the Navajo reservation. And it's very exciting work. And just want to add, any of you have final thoughts or things you'd like to add? It's always hard in these large capacity places, so just jump in.
Well, Scott, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity. And you actually touched on something just at the very end that brings us full circle, and that we are hoping that our anthology inspires the next and the next and the next generation of writers. And that is ultimately our goal. What we didn't mention when we put in a plug for selling the book, because obviously every press depends on their authors to sell their books, is that every bit of the profit from this book is going back to serve the effort to foster the skills and talents of the next generation of Navajo writers. So the royalties from this book will continue to feed that process. So literally and then figuratively, we hope this book continues to feed and inspire future generations of writers. And I think that actually is the biggest response to COVID that we might be talking about, is that all of these writers and all of and the contributors, and we hope the readers, continue to find new ways to thrive in the midst of the challenges that they're facing. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Any other last words from my colleagues?
Well, thank you all again so much. And we appreciate all our attendees for joining in from around the country. And you have a wonderful week at Ollie, and we'll see you back on Wednesday for our next speaker series. So thank you all again so much, and take care.
Thank you. Bye.